The morning shift at Rosewood Diner started the same way it always did. Elena Carter tied her apron behind her back, tucked a notepad into her pocket, and pushed through the swinging door into a room that smelled like burnt coffee and maple syrup. She had been doing this for 3 years, 5 days a week, sometimes 6 when the rent was late. The pay was decent enough to survive on, and too small to do anything more than that. She was not unhappy exactly. That was the honest answer she gave herself when she had time to think about it. She had her small apartment on Clover Street, her collection of secondhand books stacked along the windowsill, and Nora Ellis 2 tables over making faces at difficult customers behind their backs. Life had a rhythm, and Elena had learned to move inside it without complaining too loudly. Then her phone rang during the 15-minute break she took at 10:30, and everything shifted. It was her mother. The voice came through bright and fast, the way it always did when there was news that needed to be delivered before the other person had a chance to prepare. Diana was engaged. The words landed softly, but their weight pressed down hard. Diana, her younger sister by 4 years, had been dating a man named Patrick for 8 months. Now they were engaged. There would be a family reunion in 3 weeks at their aunt's house in Cincinnati, and the whole extended family would be there, and everyone would be asking questions. And Elena's mother finished by saying she just wanted Elena to be prepared. Prepared. That was the word she chose. Elena leaned against the wall outside the kitchen and stared at the cracked paint above the supply shelf. She was genuinely happy for Diana. She loved her sister without condition. But she was also 27 years old, single, working a diner job. And the last time she had brought anyone home to a family gathering was 2 years ago. When she arrived alone and watched her aunts exchange quiet looks across the dinner table, she called Nora as soon as her mother hung up. "I need someone to come with me to this reunion," Elena said, without greeting. "Not a real someone. Just someone who looks like a someone." Nora laughed so hard she nearly dropped her phone. "You want a fake boyfriend?" "I want a buffer," Elena corrected. "Someone to stand next to me so Aunt Ruth stops asking if I have a thyroid problem, because that is apparently why I'm still single." "Elena, I love you, but I cannot pretend to be your boyfriend. I lack the necessary equipment. I know that. I need to figure something out." She walked back to the floor thinking about it all morning, going through the motions of taking orders and refilling coffee cups and smiling at the couple near the window who always ordered the same thing and called each other sweetheart, in a way that had started to feel like a small punishment. At noon, the diner's busiest hour, a man sat down at table 7 alone. Elena noticed him the way you notice something out of place. Not because he was remarkably tall or strikingly handsome, though he was both of those things. She noticed him because he sat with the kind of stillness that people in the service industry learn to read quickly. He was not checking his phone. He was not looking around the room. He sat with both hands resting on the table and looked at the menu as though it contained information. He genuinely intended to process. He wore a dark navy jacket over a simple shirt, no tie, no visible watch of the kind that people wore to announce how much they had spent on a watch. He looked like someone who had nothing to prove and had decided quite firmly that proving things was beneath him. Elena took a breath and walked over. "What can I get for you today?" she asked. He looked up. His eyes were a steady, unhurried brown, and his jawline carried 2 days of stubble that had not arrived by accident. He glanced at her name tag. "Black coffee, please, Elena," he said. "And whatever the soup is today. Tomato basil. That works." She wrote it down and turned to leave when her phone buzzed in her apron pocket. She should have ignored it. She always kept her phone on silent during the shift, but she had forgotten to switch it back after Nora called. The buzz was followed by her ringtone, which she had set to a cheerful little melody, and now deeply regretted. And she fumbled to silence it, but not before the man at table 7 glanced up with a neutral expression. "Sorry," she said, and stepped toward the counter. The call was from her cousin Bethany, who had apparently already heard the news and wanted to know if Elena was bringing anyone too. Cincinnati, because the seating arrangements needed to be finalized. Elena pressed the phone close and spoke in a low voice. "I am working on it," she said. "You always say that." "I am genuinely working on it this time, Elena. Aunt Ruth already asked your mother if you were seeing a therapist." I am only telling you this because I care." She hung up and stood there for a moment with her hand pressed flat against the counter. Then she poured the black coffee and carried it to table 7, set it down, and was turning away when the man spoke. "I did not mean to overhear that," he said, "but I could not help it." "You need someone to attend a family event with you." Elena turned slowly. "That is a fairly personal thing to comment on." "You are right," he said. "I apologize. It is just that I have a similar problem." He paused. "My name is James Whitfield." The name landed, and she recognized it immediately the way most people in Ohio would. Whitfield Tech had its headquarters in Columbus. The company had been in the local news 3 times in the past year. Once for a merger, once for a charitable contribution to 2 public schools, and once because its founder had been named one of the 40 under 40 by a national business publication. She had glanced at that last article while waiting for a table to clear. She looked at him with new attention, but kept her expression even. "And your similar problem?" she asked. He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "My mother hosts a gala every spring. It is a fundraising event, but it functions primarily as a stage for her to present my life to people she wants to impress. She has been telling her circle that I am in a serious relationship. I am not. The gala is in 4 weeks. If I arrive alone, she will spend the evening engineering introductions to women she has personally approved, which is exhausting for everyone involved." Elena stared at him. "So you need someone to stand next to you at a party." "I need someone who is intelligent enough to hold a conversation and confident enough not to be rattled by my mother, who is a formidable woman. And you heard me on the phone and thought I qualified? I thought you might be interested in a straightforward arrangement," he said. "You attend my event with me, and I attend yours with you. 2 appearances, 2 weeks apart, no complications." Nora materialized from behind the counter at that precise moment, pretending to wipe down the coffee machine and failing entirely to hide the fact that she was absorbing every syllable. Elena ignored her with the practiced ease of someone who had been ignoring Nora's interruptions for years. "I do not know you," Elena said. "No," he agreed. "That is something that can be addressed over soup, if you are willing." She should have said no. Every reasonable instinct she had lined up in favor of saying no. She was a waitress from Ohio, and this was a billionaire she had met 8 minutes ago who had proposed a social arrangement over a cup of black coffee, as though that were a perfectly ordinary way to spend a Tuesday. She thought about Diana's engagement and Aunt Ruth's quiet judgment in the seating arrangements that apparently required knowing whether she was arriving with someone. "I finish at 3, she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. Something quieter and more careful. "I will be here." She refilled 2 tables and helped Nora with the lunch rush, and spent the next 2.5 hours telling herself it was just a conversation. By the time she pulled off her apron and sat down across from James Whitfield in the corner booth with a cup of tea going cold between her hands, she had almost convinced herself that was true. What she did not know yet was that nothing about James Whitfield's presence in her diner that morning had been accidental, and the secret he was carrying had roots deep enough to change the entire shape of her life. The Whitfield estate sat at the end of a long private road lined with oak trees, so old and tall they formed a canopy that filtered the afternoon light into something golden and serious. Elena sat in the passenger seat of James's car and watched the house come into view through the windshield, and told herself firmly that she was not impressed. She was absolutely impressed. The house was not the kind of enormous that felt empty. It was the kind of enormous that felt intentional, every window placed with purpose, the stone facade worn just enough to suggest history without suggesting neglect. There were flower beds along the front path that looked as though someone tended them with genuine affection rather than obligation. James had suggested she'd spend the weekend before the gala at the estate so they could establish the basic details of their arrangement. Names of family members, shared anecdotes, the kind of surface information a real couple would carry naturally into conversation. It was practical. Elena had agreed because it was practical, and for no other reason she was willing to examine too closely. She had packed a bag the night before while Nora sat on her bed and offered commentary. "This is either the beginning of something wonderful," Nora had said, "or the beginning of a story you tell at dinner parties for the rest of your life." "It is neither," Elena had said, folding a blouse she almost never wore. "It is a transaction. Transactions do not usually make people fold their good blouse." Elena had thrown a sock at her and changed the subject. Now, standing in the entrance hall of the Whitfield estate with her overnight bag at her feet and a ceiling above her that was genuinely too high to feel domestic, she repeated the word transaction quietly in her mind like a small, sturdy fence. Helen Marsh appeared from a hallway to the left. She was a woman somewhere in her early 60s with silver hair pulled back neatly and eyes that took in information quickly and gave very little away. She introduced herself as the housekeeper and said she had prepared the East guest room and that dinner would be at 7. She said all of this while looking at Elena with an expression that was not unfriendly but was absolutely measuring. "Helen has been with the family for 22 years, James said from beside Elena. "Knows everything about this house, including where the bodies are buried," Helen said pleasantly, and walked back down the hallway. Elena decided immediately that she liked Helen Marsh. James showed her to the guest room, which was large and quietly decorated in shades of cream and soft green. There was a window seat that overlooked a garden, and Elena went directly to it because she could not help herself. Below, someone had planted roses in careful rows with small stone paths running between them. "Your mother's garden?" she asked. "Mine, actually," James said from the doorway. She turned to look at him, and he seemed briefly surprised that he had volunteered that. As though the information had slipped out from somewhere, he kept it stored for private use. He cleared his throat. "My mother's suite is in the West Wing. She arrives this evening. I want you to understand before she gets here that she is not a simple woman to navigate." "You already warned me about that at the diner. I am warning you again." Lena turned back to the window. "I can handle formidable women, James. I have been handling Aunt Ruth since I was 11. She heard something close to a quiet laugh from the doorway. When she looked back, he was gone. Patrice Whitfield arrived at 6:15 in a black car driven by a man, who opened her door before the vehicle had fully stopped moving. She was a tall woman in her early 60s, impeccably dressed in the kind of way that required effort to make look effortless. Her hair was the same dark shade as James's, and her eyes moved across the entrance hall and settled on Elena, with the unhurried focus of someone conducting an assessment. "So you are Elena," she said. "I am," Elena said. Patrice studied her for a long moment. "James tells me you are a bookkeeper, among other things." "What other things?" "I read extensively. I grow tomatoes on my fire escape. I can solve the Saturday crossword in under 20 minutes on a good week." Patrice's expression did not change, but something behind her eyes shifted slightly. She turned to James. "She speaks directly." "Yes," James said. "I find it useful." Patrice said nothing more and walked toward the dining room, and Elena exhaled slowly through her nose. Dinner was a careful performance. Patrice asked questions the way a lawyer asks questions, each one designed to test the answer that came before it. How long had they been together? Where had they met? What did Elena think of James's habit of working until midnight on project launches? Elena answered steadily, relying on the details she and James had agreed on. And James filled in the gaps with a calm fluency that told her he was good at presenting a version of things. But it was the unscripted moments that surprised her. When Patrice asked what Elena valued most in a person, Elena said honesty, without pausing to think about whether it fit the narrative they had built. James looked at her from across the table with an expression she could not fully read. When Patrice asked James what he admired about Elena, he was quiet for just a beat longer than the script required. Then he said, "She does not adjust herself to fit the room she is standing in." He said it looking at Elena and not at his mother. Patrice noticed. Elena noticed too, and spent the rest of dinner being very careful not to notice too much. After Patrice retired for the evening, Elena and James sat in the library with tea that Helen had left on the low table without being asked. The room was lined floor to ceiling with books. and Elena had to consciously stop herself from standing up and reading the spines. "Did well," James said. "You sound surprised, not surprised, relieved. My mother has reduced previous candidates to single-syllable answers inside of 10 minutes. Elena looked at him. "Previous candidates? So you've done this before?"
Yes.
He set down his cup. "Once, 2 years ago, it did not end cleanly." She did not push further. There was a line in his voice that told her the story lived somewhere painful, and he was not offering the door open. She respected that. She had her own closed doors. They talked instead about small things. He asked about Ohio, and she told him about growing up in a house where the kitchen was always warm and the roof leaked into places, and her father had fixed both leaks every spring, and they returned every autumn without fail. He listened in the way that people rarely listened, without preparing his next sentence. While she was still finishing hers, she asked him why he had started Whitfield Tech, and he told her something she suspected. He did not tell often. He said his father had left when James was 12 and left behind a company that was failing, and a set of debts that took his mother 7 years to clear. James had built Whitfield Tech partly from determination and partly from something he described as quiet fury. "That is not a small thing to carry," Elena said.
No.
He agreed. "But it is useful fuel." She went to bed that night, thinking about the garden he had planted below her window and the way he had said. She did not adjust herself to fit the room, and whether a person could be both entirely calculated and entirely genuine at the same time, the next 2 days folded into a rhythm she had not expected. James worked in the mornings from his study, and Elena read in the library or walked the grounds. In the afternoons, they practiced their story, sitting across from each other in the sitting room, while Helen pretended not to listen from the hallway. But the sessions kept drifting from the prepared material into actual conversation, and neither of them moved to stop it. He showed her the section of the garden where he was trying to grow lavender, unsuccessfully. She told him about the novel she had started writing 2 years ago and abandoned, and started twice more since then. He asked what it was about, and she said it was about a woman who spent so long taking care of everyone else that she forgot she was allowed to want things for herself. He said that sounded less like fiction and more like a diary entry, and she laughed and threw a gardening glove at him, and he caught it without looking up from the lavender. On the 3rd day, Robert Callum arrived. He drove himself, which seemed unusual for a man of his obvious wealth. He was broad-shouldered and wore his silver hair with the particular confidence of a man who had decided aging made him more impressive rather than less. He arrived at the estate for what James described as a brief business meeting, and Elena crossed paths with him in the hallway. Outside the dining room, Robert Callum stopped when he saw her. Something moved across his face quickly, too quickly for her to identify it. And then it was gone, and he was smiling with a warmth that felt like it had been manufactured somewhere and shipped in. "You must be Elena," he said. "I must be," she said. "Your father was Gerald Carter." "Wasn't he?" he said. It was not a question. Her heart pressed flat against her ribs. "He was." "Good man," Robert said easily. "I knew him some years ago, briefly," smiled again and continued down the hallway, and Elena stood very still watching him go. Her father had died 4 years ago. Heart failure, sudden and unfair. When she was 23 and had not yet learned how to absorb that kind of loss properly, he had left behind her mother, her sister, a small house in Ohio, and a set of financial troubles that Elena had never fully understood because the paperwork was complicated and the lawyer handling the estate had been difficult to reach, and eventually the trail had gone cold. She found James in his study that evening and stood in the doorway until he looked up. "How does Robert Callum know my father's name?" she asked. James set down his pen. His expression told her something before his words did. It told her that the question was not unexpected. "Elena," he started. "Tell me," she said quietly. He stood and walked around the desk and gestured toward the chairs by the window. He sat across from her and leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, and the look on his face was something she had not seen there before. It was not calculation. It was not the careful neutrality he wore in most rooms. It was something that looked almost like regret. Robert Callum has been a peripheral figure in 3 financial situations that ended badly for working families in this region over the past decade, James said. He works at the edge of legality, structuring agreements that appear sound and unravel later in ways that benefit him and damage everyone else. Lena felt the room grow very still around her. And my father. Your father signed an agreement with one of Callum's subsidiary companies 9 years ago. A small business investment. The agreement had a clause buried in the 3rd addendum that Callum used for years. Later, to take a significant portion of what your father had built, he paused. I believe the stress of that situation contributed to what happened to your father's health. The words sat between them like something heavy and breakable. How long have you known this? Elena asked. Her voice was steady in a way she was not entirely feeling. James looked at her without looking away. Longer than I should have waited to tell you. She stood up and walked to the window and pressed her fingers against the cold glass and looked out at the garden in the dark. Her father had worked himself down to the bone his whole life and had been quietly taken apart by a man with a buried clause and a smile manufactured and shipped in. And James Whitfield, sitting in his study with his organized bookshelves and his unsuccessful lavender and his quiet fury, had known about it. Why did you not tell me at the diner? She asked without turning around. He was quiet for a moment. Because I needed to know first if you were someone who could handle what comes after knowing. She turned then and looked at him across the room. His face was open in a way that cost him something to allow. And now? She asked. Now I think you are exactly that person, he said. I just hope you can forgive me for taking the time to be sure. She did not answer him that night. She went to bed and lay awake listening to the house settle around her, feeling the weight of what she had just learned press against her chest alongside something else. Something that was not quite anger anymore. Something more complicated and less comfortable and far more difficult to name. Outside her window, the garden was dark and she could not see the roses from there, but she knew exactly where they were. Elena did not sleep that night. She lay in the cream and green guest room, with her eyes open and her mind moving through every conversation she had ever had with her father. About money, about stress, about the particular way his shoulders used to carry tension in the last years of his life. He had never told her the details. He had always said things were being sorted, that she should not worry. That he had made some decisions that were complicated but manageable. She had believed him because she had wanted to believe him and because he was her father, and fathers were supposed to know how to sort things now. She understood that someone had been quietly unsorting everything. He worked while he smiled and told his daughter not to worry. She got up before dawn and went to the kitchen and found Helen Marsh already there, moving around the space with the comfortable authority of someone who had owned that kitchen in every way except legally for 2 decades. Helen looked at her once and poured a second cup of tea without being asked. Elena sat at the kitchen table and wrapped both hands around the warm cup and said nothing for a while. Helen did not push her. She simply moved around the kitchen with quiet efficiency and let the silence be what it needed to be. Why long have you worked for this family? Elena asked eventually. 22 years, Helen said. Since James was 12 years old? Then you know him. Better than most, Helen said. She set a plate of toast on the table and sat across from Elena for the first time since she had arrived. He is not a man who does things without reason. Sometimes the reason takes longer to arrive at than people would like. But it always arrives. Elena looked at her. Did you know why he came to the diner that day? Helen was quiet for just a moment. I knew he had been looking into Robert Callum for several months. I knew that research had led him to certain families. I did not know what he intended to do about it. She folded her hands on the table. What I do know is that he has not looked at anyone the way he looks at you in a very long time. Possibly ever. Elena stared at her tea. That is either comforting or complicated, she said. In my experience, Helen said, picking up her own cup, it is usually both. James found her in the garden at 7 in the morning. She was sitting on the low stone bench near the rose beds with her knees pulled up and her second cup of tea going cold beside her. He came and sat at the other end of the bench without asking, and looked at the roses, and did not speak first, which she had noticed was something he did when he understood that words needed to be earned. She spoke first. "Tell me everything," she said. "Not the careful version. Not the version where you decide how much I can handle. All of it." He nodded once. Then he told her he had begun investigating Robert Callum 18 months ago. After a colleague approached him about a failed investment that followed a familiar pattern, James had hired a private analyst, and what came back was a map of quiet destruction spanning 12 years, 14 families, and 4 states. Callum never broke the law in any way that was clean enough to prosecute easily. He worked in the spaces between regulations, in buried clauses and misleading language and agreements designed to appear generous until the moment they were not. Elena's father's name had appeared in the documentation. 8 months ago, Gerald Carter, small business owner, Ohio. The investment agreement, the buried clause. The systematic withdrawal of funds over a period of 2 years that coincided exactly with the last difficult years of Gerald Carter's life. James had driven to the diner on a Tuesday that was not accidental. He had wanted to see her. He had told himself it was reconnaissance, a way of understanding the people affected before he moved forward with what he was building. A legal case. A documented exposure. Something that would be solid enough to hold in court and public enough to matter. And then you sat down at the table, and I answered your question about the soup, Elena said. And then you answered my question about the soup, he said quietly. And everything I thought I was doing became considerably more complicated. She looked at him. The morning light was coming through the oak trees at a low angle, and it caught the side of his face, and she thought about what Helen had said, and about the lavender that would not grow, and about the way he had listened to her talk about her. Father's leaking roof without preparing his next sentence. Should have told me from the beginning, she said. Yes, he said, without qualification and without excuse. Just yes, clean and direct. You let me walk into an arrangement without giving me the information I needed to make a real choice. Yes, he said again. I told myself I was protecting the investigation. The truth is, I was also afraid that if you knew, you would leave before I could understand why I did not want you to. The garden was very quiet. A bird moved through the roses somewhere to the left. It is not a small thing to admit, she said. No, he agreed. But you asked for all of it. Elena set down her cold tea and looked at the roses her father had never seen and thought about Gerald Carter sorting things and carrying tension in his shoulders and telling his daughters not to worry. She thought about Diana getting engaged and Aunt Ruth asking questions in her own small apartment with the second-hand books along the windowsill. She thought about all the ways she had built a life that was sturdy and sufficient, and quietly longing for something it was not allowing itself to name. What happens now? She asked. With Callum. The documentation is complete, James said. My legal team has been ready for 3 weeks. I was waiting until after the gala because I did not want the exposure to affect the event and thereby draw attention away from my mother's charitable work, which matters regardless of everything else. He paused. I can move forward now if you want me to. Or we can wait until after Cincinnati. It is your family in your father's name, and you have the right to decide the timing. She looked at him for a long moment. Move forward, she said. Do not wait. He nodded. They sat together in the garden for another 20 minutes without speaking, and it was not uncomfortable. It was the particular quiet of 2 people who had just handed each other something real and were giving each other time to hold it properly. The gala happened 3 days later. Elena wore a dress she had borrowed from Nora. Deep blue, simple, and well cut. And Nora had spent 45 minutes on her. Heron told her she looked like someone who had always belonged in rooms like that, and to remember that belonging had nothing to do with the size of your bank account and everything to do with the way you carried your own name. The Whitfield Gala was held in the Grand Hall of a historic building in Columbus. There were flowers and soft lighting, and people dressed in the careful way of those who attended these events regularly. Elena moved through the room beside James, and he kept one hand at the small of her back with a steadiness that she had stopped trying to categorize as performance. Patrice found them within the first 20 minutes. She looked at Elena with the same measuring expression from dinner, and then said something that Elena had not expected. "You wore blue," she said. James's father always said blue was the most honest color. He claimed people in blue never tried to be something they were not. Elena held her gaze. "I did not know that. I just liked the dress." Patrice studied her. Then something moved across her face that was not quite warmth, but was the beginning of a path toward it. "Yes," she said. "I imagine you did." She touched Elena's arm briefly and moved on to greet other guests, and James leaned slightly toward Elena and said in a low voice, "That is the closest she has come to approving of anyone in 6 years." "She touched my arm," Elena said. "She touched your arm," he confirmed. "That is practically a standing ovation." Elena laughed, and it was real, and James smiled at the sound of it in a way he did not bother to hide. Robert Callum was at the gala. He arrived late and moved through the room with the confident ease of a man who had not yet learned that the ground beneath him had been shifting for months. He found Elena near the drinks table and smiled his manufactured smile. "Miss Carter," he said. "Lovely to see you again, Mr. Callum," she said evenly. "Enjoy your evening." She said nothing more, and walked away and found James and stood beside him and felt something settle in her chest. Not peace exactly, not yet, but the early structure of it. 2 days later, the story broke. James's legal team released the documentation to a financial journalist and a consumer protection organization simultaneously. The story ran in 3 publications within 24 hours. Robert Callum's name appeared in headlines alongside words like predatory and systemic, and the kind of language that could not be walked back or minimized. By the end of the week, 2 of the families mentioned in the documentation had been contacted by legal representatives. Elena's mother received a call on a Thursday afternoon that made her sit down at the kitchen table and cry quietly for 10 minutes. Elena drove to Cincinnati the following weekend, not for a reunion, but to sit with her mother and hold her hand and tell her that what happened to Gerald Carter was not his failure and had never been his failure. Her mother listened and cried again, and then made coffee and took out a photograph of Elena's father from the drawer where she kept the things that were too important to leave lying around. Elena looked at the photograph for a long time. The family reunion happened anyway because these things always did. Diana arrived with Patrick, and the engagement ring caught the light from every angle, and Aunt Ruth had questions about seating arrangements in Elena's relationship, status, and the general trajectory of her life choices. James arrived at the front door at 2 in the afternoon, carrying a bottle of wine and wearing a jacket that was slightly too formal for a family lunch in Cincinnati, and managing somehow to look entirely comfortable about it. Diana opened the door and stared at him and then looked at Elena over his shoulder with an expression that cycled through surprise, assessment, and delight inside of 3 seconds. Aunt Ruth appeared behind Diana and looked James up and down, and then looked at Elena and said nothing at all, which was the loudest thing Aunt Ruth had ever communicated. In Elena's memory, James shook hands with Patrick and complimented Diana's ring with specific and genuine detail and helped Elena's mother carry dishes from the kitchen without being asked, and answered every question from the extended family with the kind of patient directness that earned respect from people who were not easily impressed. During lunch, Diana leaned close to Elena and said very quietly, "He is real, isn't he? Not like a person you hired." Elena looked at her sister. "He is real." Diana squeezed her hand under the table. After lunch, Elena and James walked to the small park 2 streets from her mother's house. It was the park where Elena had played as a child, where her father had pushed her on a swing every Sunday afternoon until she was old enough to decide She was too old for swings and had then privately missed it for years. The trees were the same. The bench near the fountain was the same. They sat, and the afternoon was cool and quiet, and James looked at the fountain and Elena looked at the space where the swings used to be before the city, replaced them with a climbing structure. "You for coming today?" she said. "I wanted to come," he said. "This was not part of the arrangement." He turned to look at her. "Elena, there is no arrangement anymore." She met his eyes. When did it stop being an arrangement? He thought about it honestly, which was something she had come to understand was the only way he knew how to think. "Somewhere between the tomato soup and the lavender that refuses to grow," he said. "I cannot identify the exact moment. I just know that at some point I stopped thinking about what this was supposed to be and started thinking about what I wanted it to become." She felt the familiar press of something large and warm and slightly terrifying moving through her chest. She had written about this feeling a dozen times in the novel she kept starting and abandoning. She had described it in characters and given it to people who existed only on pages because it felt safer there. "I am a waitress from Ohio," she said. "I have a small apartment and a fire escape garden, and a novel I have started 3 times. I know," he said. "Your world is not my world." "It could be," he said. "Or we could build something that belongs to both of us. I am not asking you to enter my world. I am asking if you want to build a new one." Paused. "I am not good at being vulnerable. I was taught very young that vulnerability was a liability. But I have spent the last 3 weeks understanding that the most important things I have ever wanted required me to stop treating my own heart like a business risk." He looked at her steadily. "You are worth the risk. Elena, you have been worth it since you told me the soup was tomato basil." She laughed, and it broke something open in her chest in the best possible way. "You are going to have to be patient with me," she said. "I am not someone who moves fast. I have spent 18 months building a legal case against a man who thought he was untouchable," James said. "I understand patience." She looked at him for a long moment. The afternoon light was soft, and the fountain was making its gentle sound, and somewhere nearby, a child was running and laughing with the full-body commitment that only children managed. "Finish the lavender," she said. He blinked. "What? The lavender in your garden? Stop giving up on it. Try a different soil mix and give it the south-facing wall instead of the east. Lavender needs more sun than you are giving it." She held his gaze. "Some things just need the right conditions. They do not need to be abandoned." He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his expression that was not calculated or contained or carefully managed. It was open and a little unsteady and entirely genuine. "Stay," he said simply. "Not at the estate. Not as a guest. Just in my life. We figure out the geography later." She thought about her father and the leaking roof, and the way he fixed it every spring with the faith that the fixing mattered, even when it returned. She thought about the story she kept starting about the woman who forgot she was allowed to want things. She thought about second-hand books and fire escape tomatoes, and Nora sitting on her bed saying, "This is either something wonderful or the best dinner party story you will ever own." She thought it might be both. "Okay," she said. He reached over and took her hand, and they sat together on the bench near the fountain in the park where Elena Carter had played as a child, and the afternoon moved around them at its own unhurried pace, and neither of them felt any need to rush it. That evening, Elena's mother stood in the kitchen doorway and watched James help clear the table with the same careful attention he brought to everything, and she looked at Elena and smiled the way mothers smile when they recognize something true in the months that followed. Robert Callum's case moved through the legal system with the steady momentum of something built on solid ground. 3 families received settlements. 2 regulatory bodies opened formal inquiries. Callum's name carried a different weight in business circles, and the smile he had manufactured so carefully lost most of its usefulness. Elena finished her novel. She dedicated it to Gerald Carter, who fixed the roof every spring and never once stopped believing the fixing was worth doing. Patrice Whitfield attended the small publication celebration. James organized and stood beside Elena at the book table and picked up a copy and read the dedication and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Your father sounds like a man who understood that love is a form of stubbornness." She bought 2 copies and had James carry them to her car. The lavender grew. It took a new soil mix and the south-facing wall and the better part of 4 months, but it grew. And on a Saturday morning in late summer, Elena stood in the garden with her coffee and watched it move in the warm breeze and felt something she had been writing about for years finally settle into her bones as something lived rather than imagined. James came up beside her and looked at the lavender with the expression of a man who had won something that mattered. "I told you," she said. "You told me," he agreed. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and the garden was warm and full of color, and the house behind them was large enough to have echoed with emptiness. For years before it decided to be something else, Elena Carter had come to this estate with an overnight bag and a borrowed blouse and a plan that was supposed to be simple and clean and temporary,